the SEC. Welcome, Peter Sondhelm from London. Appreciate you joining us, Peter. I hope to see you in July when I go there. So this is a brand new presentation that I literally finished up this morning, but it's based on my four-frame exhibit that I exhibited for the first time at the Rocky Mountain Stamp Show here in May, earlier this month. And I am probably going to just take 30 minutes or so to go through this. This is about the postal history of Telemark coast of Norway. So many people will have a hard time putting Norway on the map, maybe not in this room, but where is the Telemark coast of Norway? Well, if you look at the map of Norway, Norway is divided into approximately 20 counties. I say approximately because they just redid them in 2020, and there was lots of negative feedback, and so they had to switch back to what it used to be. But this is Telemark County right here. And the Telemark coast is just this little sliver right there. And so it's basically on the outlet of the Oslo fjord. So, Oslo, my hometown, is right there. And the Telemark coast is just the western side of the Oslo fjord. And if we zoom in here, you can see that it consists of 5 primary communities. Skien, which is the administrative center, Porsgrunn, Brevik, Langesund, which was host to Nordia, the biggest Scandinavian stamp show in 2024. And my personal favorite, Kragerø, because I spent all my summers there and I'm visiting there in about 2 weeks. So these are all fairly small towns. They are, this is the 1900 census because I'm talking about postal history in the 19th century. And, none of them were much over 10,000. Kragerø had actually peaked at about 12,000 just a few years earlier, and then it went into a period of decline. The number afterwards is the year they got a post office. So for some towns like Kragerø, that coincided with the same year where they became recognized as an official town, whereas Langesund was much, much later than many of the other ones. So why the Telemark coast of Norway, and why am I giving a presentation on this? Well, first of all, it was the most significant economic region in Norway in the 19th century outside of the major cities like Oslo or Kristiania, as it was known in the 19th century, Bergen and Drammen. And it's interesting from a postal history perspective because of all the geographical challenges that I will share with you. And it's a story that I don't think has been told. I haven't seen any other exhibits on the Telemark coast of Norway. Of course, I have a personal connection. So all Norwegians more or less have a cabin. Some have 2, one by the sea for the summer and one in the mountains for the winter. My family had one by the sea, and it was off the Kragerø coast on an island. So I spent all my summers growing up there, and headed back there to see my sister here in a few weeks. And this is based on my first 4-frame exhibit by the same name. It's great to have Mike Lee, who was my first responder, sitting here in the front row. So okay, so let's go back in time to get some perspective on the Norwegian history. So you all heard about the Vikings, and they ruled the seas, from about 700 until 1040, when Christianity found Norway and mellowed out those brute Vikings. The second thing that happened was in 1349, in the 14th century, the Black Plague arrived in Norway, in Bergen. A ship came into Bergen. And they estimate Norway's population at the time to have been around 450,000 people. And the Black Plague decimated more percentage-wise population in Norway than any other European country. And they estimate, of course, this is 650 years ago, but they estimate that by the time the Black Plague was over, only 150,000 people were left. So it decimated over 60% of the population. Pretty significant. This is yes.
Is there genetic reason that the Norwegian people were more susceptible to the plague, or why
I have not seen any research on that. You think, if anything, it would be the opposite because they were more spread out. They weren't in big cities. And there's no research that I know that suggests that the Norwegian DNA was more susceptible to the bacteria. It could be less ventilation and more spreading. And it had happened over winter between 1349 and 1350. So could have been that time of year that impacted it. They estimate between 60 and 70% of the population died as a result of the bubonic plague, or the Black Plague as we know it. I want to give thanks to Ring Ornes. He is my ancestor that survived the Black Plague and allows me to be here to present this presentation to you today. There were obviously many others, but he is the oldest person in my family tree. He is my 18th great grandfather. And ironically, he lived in Sunadal, Norway, which is up on the west coast of Norway, where my family lived for generations. I finally went back and visited there a few years ago. I've been back twice now, and I got to see my great grandfather's farm. And what's funny is they weren't very innovative when it came to names. So my great grandfather would be Evan Larson. He would have a son named Lars, who became Lars Evanson, and then he had a son named Evan Larson, and it went like that every other generation until my great grandfather decided that enough of this Larson crap. There's too many Larsons in Norway, and he took my name, Brand, out of thin air, from what we can tell, in 1919. So after the Black Plague, Norway went into a long period of severe economic hardship. The combination of wide open spaces, a lot of uh, population gone, a lot of nobility gone, a lot of farms just deserted. In fact, the name Ødegaard, and if you Arsenal fans, there's a player named Ødegaard playing for the uh, Premier League team Arsenal in London. That's for you, Peter. Ødegaard is a very common name in Norwegian, and it means deserted farm. Øde means deserted or lone, and God means farm. So anytime you see Ødegaard, that's a name that came about after the Black Plague, because people found these empty farms and they took them over. But Norway was extremely weakened, and in 1390s, now we're 40 years after the plague, King Olaf IV, who has been assigned King of Norway by his mother, who's the Danish king, becomes King of Norway. And he dies at an early age, which means that the Queen of Denmark is now also de facto the Queen of Norway. So what happens is you have a really weak country with very little resources, and you have a Danish queen. And essentially, at that point, we go into a union with Denmark that lasts almost 400 years. And initially, Sweden was also part of that union. It was called the Kalmar Union. Sweden exited sometime in the 16th century, but Norway remained under Danish rule until 1814. In spite of being under Danish rule, we develop our own postal systems in 1647. So Denmark gets theirs in 1624. In fact, if any of you went to Hafnia exhibit in Copenhagen in 2024, that was the 400th anniversary of the Danish postal system. And it's a shame they couldn't keep it alive for another year. We know that the Danes did away with their stamps last year. That's a totally different story. But Norway gets their first postal system in 1647. Norway has a lot of challenges when it comes to communication and delivering mail. We have long coastlines, we have mountains and fjords, we have a very low population as a result of the plague, and also as a result of living up north. Norway to this day is about 5 million people, which is less than the state of Colorado. The population is scattered. We have this thing called winter, which makes it hard to travel. And in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, the roads were extremely limited. The Telemark coast is one of the most important industrial areas in Norway. Their key industries in the 19th century, which is when this story takes place, was logging, lots and lots of forests, and rivers on which that timber could be floated down to the sea and shipped off to continental Europe. Shipping, fishing, and shipbuilding. These were all industries that flourished in the Telemark coast in the 19th century. The other thing from a postal history perspective is that the Telemark coast is along the southern portion of the very important Western mail route. So about half of the mail delivered to the western towns of Stavanger and Bergen, two major important towns on the western coast of Norway, came along the southern coast of Norway through the Telemark coast. So it's important for industry, it's important for mail delivery, and they were also key ports for international trades, those 5 towns that I mentioned. We also believe that the post office thought them important enough that after the first 3 towns in Norway had received postmarks in 1845, the next 5 communities to get postmarks were all those 5 Telemark coast communities, which again suggests why they were important in the mid-19th century Norway. Really quick, kind of just yes.
Before Oslo?
No, after Oslo. Oslo got theirs in 1845. They were called Christiania, and then Kragerø, Langesund, all those got theirs in 1848. Just to put things into historic perspective where we are in the 19th century, the Enlightenment reform, which brought with it press reform, happened around 1771, 1772, right when this story begins. And I'll explain in a minute why 1771. Somebody said, is that because that's your oldest cover? No, it is. But that's actually not the reason why. It is another reason because there was a major postal reform, which we'll talk about. But also the Napoleonic War impacts Norway in 1807 to 1814. In fact, I have a cover from Norway sent from Bergen to Boston in 1812 on exhibit down in the Scandinavian exhibit, if you want to see it. And it's a miracle that that cover made it through, considering that US and Britain were at war. So Danish rule ends in 1814. And on May 17th, 1814, which we just celebrated last week or 2 weeks ago, that's our Constitution Day. And that's when Norway adopted their own constitution. But we felt we were not strong enough to stand on our own. And so we go into a union with Sweden in August of that year. And we are under Swedish rule until 1905, when it's the other bookend of this presentation. Norway abolished their nobility in 1821. They implemented Local Self-Government Act in 1837, and their first railway came about in 1854. Their first political parties were formed in 1884. So you might argue that the 19th century, a lot of things happened in Norway, more so, I would say, than even in the 20th century with World War II, and certainly in the current century. From a postal history perspective, Norway's postal system, as I said, was formed in 1647. But in the early years, there was just not a lot of mail for all those reasons I explained earlier. In 1771, we have a major postal reform that makes mail less expensive. They're building out more infrastructure, and we start to see mail growing fairly significantly. We start standardizing our postal routes. We get that Western mail route I was explaining. And in 1814, after about 70 years of private postal service contracted by the government, we get our independent postal administration at the same time of our constitution. 1827, we start seeing steamships, mail being sent by steam to Denmark, to the continent. 1845, we get our first postmarks. In 1855, we get our first postage stamps. Norway joins the Universal Postal Union in 1875. And in 1877, we convert to our current currency of kroner and øre. It's the first time we get to a decimal system for currency. And in this period, just this short period from 1771 to 1905, we have 4 different currency systems. Starting out at the beginning of the period, we are using Danish riksdaler and shillings. But ironically, postage is tied to the Lipske shilling, which is a German system. And the exchange rate is 2 Danish shillings to 1 Lipske shilling. So anytime you see one shilling on a letter, it's actually two Danish shillings. So that was confusing. That lasted until 1813. And then we convert to Riksbank shilling, which is the new Danish monetary system. We're only under that for a few years until we adopt our own system as a result of the separation from Denmark, where we go to speciedaler, ort, and shilling. And that lasts up until 1877 when we switch to the decimal system that we still have today. Most Danish, Scandinavian countries, including Sweden and Denmark and Iceland, were on the shilling system up until the 1860s and 70s. Sweden was the first one to change in the 1850s, and Denmark and Norway came along with Iceland in the 1870s. So there were a lot of challenges. If you're a postal historian pre-UPU in Scandinavia, you're dealing with a lot of challenges. Different currencies, each country having their own postal convention. Norway has a postal convention with Denmark. They had one with Sweden. They had one with Germany. And so calculating the correct rate was incredibly difficult. We even have different measurements. A mile in Norway is different than a mile in Sweden. Our unit of measurements in Norway was a lod. One lod was 15.6 grams in modern measurements. And so imagine the challenge of a letter traveling through, going from Norway to Germany. It travels through Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and then Germany, and calculating the postal rates with 4 different postal conventions, different types of measurements, different currencies. It was very, very, very challenging. So in my exhibit, I use the 5 communities of the Telemark coast in Norway, but I'm going to limit it to one, Kragerø, because otherwise we'd be here all day. And I'm just going to use Kragerø as an example. So this is one of the 5 major communities. At one point, it got bigger than Skien, which is the administrative center. They received market town privileges back in January of 1666. And market town privileges in an old Norwegian town meant that you could set up shop, that you would be given a merchant's license to set up shop, and you could operate a business. And you have to have market town privileges as a town to have merchants. Any town couldn't just have merchants. So many of the smaller towns in the region would have to go to Kragerø to do their trading. They couldn't set up a town unless the town itself had market town privileges. And Kragerø gets a post office that same year of 1666. And by the 17th century, it is the 3rd largest harbor.
Brande.
The king, yeah.
The king.
Yeah, the king did. Yep. The king could decide which towns had.
Did they have people?
I am sure they did. I am sure they did. So Kragerø is the 3rd largest harbor in the 17th century after, not Bergen, but after Kristiania, modern day Oslo, and Drammen, both further up the coast. Interestingly, Kragerø, which is closer to Denmark, is 3rd. Oslo, at the end of the Oslo fjord, is still the biggest town to this day in Norway. And population in Kragerø peaks around 1890, sort of at the pinnacle of this presentation. And today it's not actually a town, it's a municipality in Telemark County. And in the way towns and counties are structured in Norway is you have the counties, which there are of about 20, and then each county has multiple municipalities. And then municipalities can have cities. But in the case of Kragerø, it's both a town and a municipality. So this is an old 18th century painting of Kragerø. This is the same view today, what it looks like. Today, Kragerø is not an industrial town. It's not a fishing town. It's not a logging town. It's a tourist town. And to give you an idea how much this town has grown, not in population, but in the economic playings, the cabin my dad built in 1964 for approximately $2,000, including the lot, is worth about $2 million today. So it's been an incredible development from the people who enjoyed nature, who just bought a cabin on the fjord, to only the very wealthiest Norwegians who can now afford a place down there, which is unfortunate. But this is what Kragerø looks like on a sunny day, and there's not always sunny days in southern Norway, but it's a beautiful place to visit. This is me and my kids last year. Uh, Over the years, Kragerø has attracted a lot of artists. This is a painting or a drawing from the 19th century, and it shows somebody delivering, could be male. Another person who was drawn to Kragerø was Edvard Munch. Edvard Munch, if you're not familiar with him, is probably the most famous artist of Norway. The Munch Museum just relocated to downtown Oslo, and he lived in Kragerø for many years. And actually, there's a picture of him painting that very picture that you saw earlier. His most famous painting from his Kragerø era, and I'm sorry, I'm going off tangent here, but everybody loves Edvard Munch, is called Solen, which means the sun. And this was painted from Kragerø Harbor facing out into the ocean. And this is in the University of Oslo's main lobby. And it's a massive painting that covers the size of that back wall there, roughly. And he painted that in Kragerø. And he really loved that area. Kragerø, by the way, is an archipelago, so there are numerous islands before you get out into the open sea, which is partially what makes it very popular because it's very sheltered. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mail in 17th and 18th century Norway. It's very much limited to a small segment of the population, the nobility, the clericals, the government. It's low volume, high cost, and limited and challenging routes. Very limited delivery options. There's no official postal service yet delivering. Delivery happens through post farmers. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And most of the mail you find from the early period is official mail. After the Postal Reformation in the 1771, the volume starts to pick up first gradually and then more dramatically after 1850. Yes?
How literate the average populace in the 17th and 18th century Norway?
The literacy rate is estimated to have been only about 20%, so very low. So here's an example of an early letter in my collection, and nothing truly special about this one. This is an official letter. It is sent to Kragerø, and it's unpaid, which is very common in the day, so the recipient would pay. Very many of the official letters would be free, and there's just a record number on the back, so they would record. Back then the volume was so low, they would record every single letter in a logbook and assign it a bill number. So that's bill number 8. So that was the 8th letter that day in that pouch that went to Kragerø, in this case from Christiania. Here's an official letter sent from Christiania to Kragerø just a few years later. And this Christiania, again, is where, that's the capital of Norway. It's Oslo today. And it is bill number 12 and 4 shilling. So this was a paid official letter. I'm not sure why they paid, but the reason it was paid, and I forgot to mention this, in 1771, one of the major changes was that they really restricted free letters because the nobility and a lot of people abused the free mail. And so they really hampered down that unless you were, the king of Norway, letters were generally not free. And I'm exaggerating, but they really limited down free letters after 1771. Yes. It just says till. Yeah.
I thought maybe
So till had Mr. Byfogd, magistrate Bamberg, and Bamberg was a magistrate of Kragerø. And what's interesting is back then, we didn't have envelopes. So you have the content with most of these letters on the opposite side. And with a little help from ChatGPT, not because I can't read Norwegian, but I can't read the 18th century handwriting, I converted this letter into English. And in short, this is basically a letter from Christiania complaining that they need to do a better job with their, ICE agents, sorry, their not immigration, but customs people to make sure that smugglers don't get goods into Norway without paying customs. So this is the Royal West Indian Guinea and Revenue Company out of Denmark that's basically telling the King of Norway that, hey, you got to get these people down in Krager in shape here. They're letting all these goods into Norway, contraband, prohibited goods have been brought in along the coast. And we therefore respectfully request that you get this in shape, that you maintain the harbors and make sure that no prohibited smuggled goods may be brought ashore without paying customs. So it's a customs enforcement letter from 1774. And, beautiful handwriting signature down there. So really quick about the southern portion of the mail route from Christiania to Kragerø. So here's Christiania up north. This is the Oslo Fjord, and Kragerø is down here. And you'll notice along the way, if you were to not go across fjords, you'd have to travel way inland, and it would practically be impossible to get from Christiania to Kragerø without going across water. Now, some may say, well, why don't you just ship it down along the shore? Well, you got to drop off and pick up mail along the way. And the way mail worked in Norway in the 18th century is you had post farmers. Post farmers were essentially relay stations along the way where, I bring the mail from Christiania to Asker, and then you pick it up. That's like, 15 miles. Then I pick it up and bring it to Drammen, and you pick it up. And it's a relay system. And these people were not paid. These farmers were not paid. They were exempt from military duty. That was their payment. So if you are a post farmer, you don't have to serve in the military. And these rules kind of changed over the years, but in the early days, that's how it worked. And so this is what a post farmer would have looked like in the 18th, 19th century. Here's a little irony. That's a Norwegian fjord horse. And these are my Norwegian fjord horses. And real ironic, because we were talking about the Overland Trail yesterday, this is my property in Colorado, and the Overland Trail went right here. So here are two Norwegian fjord horses on the Overland Trail. So here's where my two postal history interests intercept between Norway and overland mail. Now, to get across these fjords, so there's one here by Larvik, and there's another crossing by Brevik. They use rowboats. And it cracked me up the other day when I was going through some family photos, and I found this picture of my mom. This is me in 1968. And we have a rowboat in 1968 that looks very similar to the rowboat they would have used 200 years earlier. So some things don't change. Fewer people use these now, but in my lifetime, 58 years ago, we still had those rowboats. I was at the Kragerø History Museum last summer, and they had this mailbag that I took a picture of, and this says 1735, so it's a little earlier than our period, but this is the type of mailbag that our post farmers would have used. And one thing I found interesting is the mailbag has an outer pocket, and it was not uncommon to have the official mail in one pocket, and then if your neighbor Lars was delivering a mail from just one farm to the next, it would go in the outer pocket and it would be delivered for free. So the post farmers, yes.
How do you know that? Because in the case of like the Pony Express in the United States, there was the mail from the two termini that bring the seal the bag, and then the way mail that picked up on the way was in the outer pouch.
Yeah, same idea. I read about it.
So, but you're saying the official mail was in a different pouch.
Yeah.
What wasn't way mail picked up on the way that in the outer pouch?
I think way mail picked up along the way was official and went in the inner pouch. But sometimes if your neighbor said, hey, Lars, can you take this letter from me and just deliver it to Ula down the road? They would do that sometimes. And the reason I'm bringing this up is by 1851, there was a law that you will see that cracked down on that, where they tried to stop that behavior. And it's interesting how there's a lot of parallels to the Pony Express with the post farmer relay system. They didn't have to deal with Indian attacks, but other than that, there's a lot of similarities. Another official letter, this one from Copenhagen to Kragerø. It's about the same issues. Apparently, 20 some years later, they're still dealing with contraband and smuggling. And this now the letter comes from Copenhagen instead of from Oslo. This is the seal on the back of that letter. It's kind of cool. It says General Tollkammer, Seil, Vest-Indien and Guinea Rente. I can't make it out, but it's basically the West India Toll Company. And why they call it the West Indies, it's because, well, Denmark had, the Danish West Indies. They had colonies along the Guinea coast of Africa. And so this was, the official international company that dealt with customs matters. This is a very early unpaid money letter. So money letters were actually introduced in Norway in 1745. But according to the person I purchased this one from, this is the second earliest money letter known to the Telemark coast. And it was for 12 specie and 88 shillings, which would be about $450 in today's currencies. Not a lot of money, but, they sent it in those days, probably coins. They had some bills, but I think it probably would have contained gold, and it's a thick, heavy letter. The bill number here is 18-2. Now, 18 suggests it was the 18th letter. It's not the 18th money letter, but it's the 18th letter in that pouch, and it was a $2 fee to send it. And from my understanding, they paid separate for the money letter fee, in addition to the $2 postage. Here's another interesting letter that I discovered why it was interesting after I had bought it. This was sent in 1814 from Kragerø to Amtmann Collett. Amtmann is essentially a representative, in the political party, even though we didn't have a political party, but he was nobility, Mr. Collett. And he was one of the signers of the Norwegian Constitution in Eidsvoll, just 30 days after this letter was sent. And I didn't realize that until I started researching him and who he was. I'm going through this fairly fast because I don't want to bore you with postal details. I have about 200 covers from this era. I'm just showing you a few highlights. There's certainly people in Norway with way more impressive collections than me. But here's another document that I got recently. And I mentioned earlier that all letters were recorded. Well, by the 1830s, the volume of mail had gotten so substantial that we only now record money letters. And so this is a money letter registry that was included in the bag. So if I send, in this case, mail from Kragerø to Arendal, which is further down the coast, which is not just in Disney's Frozen, it's in a real town called Arendal. I would include this mail registry of all the all the money letters. And so you can see here that, it's got a registry number 1, 2, 3, 4. That would correspond to that number right there on the back. To whom it's addressed, and what is the what's the content. And so it says banco, meaning money, and the amount. So, 20 specie 26 specie 20 specie 88 shilling, 10 specie 68 shilling, and so on. And then any notes, any special comments. What's interesting is Herlofsen, this last name, is a big shipping family in Arendal. And their great-great-great-great-grandson went to school with me at the University of Wyoming and lives in Connecticut. So I showed that to him. He got a kick out of that. Stephen Opheim, who was here this morning, said he collects mail from Scandinavian post offices in Hamburg. This is an example of a letter, an inbound letter from Hamburg to Kragerø in 1840. And the reason why I'm showing this is because it's the first time we see a postmark show up in a Scandinavian connection. So Hamburg got their postmark issued in 1838, and they had, many countries operated post offices in Hamburg, including the Danish post office. So this was a Danish post office in Hamburg, and this is a letter sent to Norway in 1840. So finally, we arrive in 1848, and the volume has grown sufficient enough that the Norwegian Postal Service issues postmarks to 8 more towns. And of those 8 towns, 5 of them are on the Telemark coast, those 5 towns I mentioned earlier. These 4 gets theirs in 1848. Langesund gets theirs in 1849, simply because Langesund didn't get a post office until 1849. But these are all, important towns, and they're early to get postmarks. These postmarks, by the way, are in use well through the end of the 19th century. I have letters with this Kragerø postmark as late as 1889, and it's really getting worn at that point. And it's been re-engraved a few times, but it's the same 1848 postmark. Here is an early use of a Skien postmark. It's black stripe, which is fairly unusual in 1849. And one thing, the plan was to only use postmarks on international mail. So the first year in 1848, you generally only see it on international mail, but by 1849, 1850, it starts to be used on all mail, both international and domestic. I was at a postal history convention with Egil Tronsen in Flekkefjord, Norway last summer, and somebody mentioned to me, Henrik Ibsen came from Skien. Henrik Ibsen is the most famous playwright of Norway. He's probably, according to Wikipedia, he's the most famous Norwegian of all time after Egil. And just kidding. And he came from Skien. And somebody said, well, do you have any mail sent to or from Ibsen? I was like, well, I don't think so. But as I was preparing my exhibit, it occurred to me that his uncle, Christian Paus, was the Skien town magistrate. And this was a letter sent from Christian Paus in 1849. And sorry not to pick on Egil, but Egil lives in Skien. So, you just now he's going to intimidate me because he knows more about this than I do. And so this is Henrik Ibsen, and he grew up in Skien, but I think after his childhood, he probably didn't spend too much time in Skien. Just a couple of other interesting letters. This was a letter written to the Porsgrunn Poor Commission. And this is a lady asking for help with burial expenses for her husband. And I only show this because it shows that in mid-19th century Norway, poverty was still very, very high. And just like we have social services today, they had social services back then, in this case, assisting with burial expenses. So it says Fattigkommisjon means the commission for the poor. So in 1851, we get a law that prohibits private postal service. And I'm not going to bother reading this whole thing to you, but essentially this is cracking down on the fact that people did put those letters in the outer pocket and just bring it to their neighbor. We are now going to fine you a fairly substantial amount if you don't follow the rule and let the postal service transport your letters. There's a lot of exceptions to this rule. Yes.
Interesting. There's a law right off this time in the United States prohibiting, requiring express companies, they can still carry the mail privately, but the U.S. government still got their postage fee, even if the U.S. government never touched it.
Yep.
And so this,
it's very similar.
Yeah, it's in the same book,
And if you look at Norway, they've copied the United States for 200 years. I mean, our Norwegian Constitution was in part inspired by ours from 1776.
My thinking is, you wonder how much communication there was between governments to say, hey, we're going to
Yeah.
start cracking down on this. So are we. It hasn't been
Probably more than you think, because we have mail correspondence between Norway and the United States going back to the 18th century. So they probably helped inspire each other, no doubt. Good point. This is an interesting one. This one is struck twice, one day apart. So you got a Shan January 2nd, we reverse our dates and months. And then down below, you got on January 3rd, it's been struck again. There are different theories as to what may have happened. They may have processed it at the end of the day, and then it has been left behind by accident, and somebody came and found it the next morning and postmarked it again.
Was the postmark associated with paying?
No, because you could have postmarks both on paid and unpaid letters. I mean, basically in this period, you have three types of letters. You have prepaid, unpaid, and free. So if government.
What did it need to be postmarked?
Well, originally just for international mail, but it just became a habit because you want to know where the letter is sent from. Here's an unpaid letter to Denmark, and this one's interesting because, well, you get the big 24 on the front, and that was the amount of shillings due when the recipient collected this letter in Denmark. I haven't added up the fee, but I think the transocean fee from Norway to Denmark would have been 15 shillings. Erik Eigil knows way more about this than I do. And then there was a domestic fee in Norway, and then there was a domestic fee in Denmark, and it probably added up to 24 shillings. But in 1854, in June of 1854, the Norwegian government decides that we're going to implement simpler postal rates. And we are going to start using this thing called stamps, effective January 1st, 1855. This is the original law. I don't know how many copies there are, but I got one of the copies that basically establishes stamps in Norway. And again, without going into too much detail, the law states that if you use a postage stamp, the postage will be 4 shilling for a domestic letter. If you don't use a stamp, we're not going to require you to use a stamp, then it's 5 shillings. So they want to encourage us to use stamps, and they discount postage if you put a stamp on it. So in January 1st, 1855, Norway gets its first stamp, Norway number 1. Mint are pretty hard to find and pretty expensive. And you will find these with quite a few different cancels. The original grid cancels were used in 1855 and 1866, and they exist with 10, 11, and 12 lines. In January of 1856, they decide to call back the grid cancels and issue 3-ring numeral cancels with a number representing the town. And in the case of the Telemark coast, there was about a 6-month lag between when the grid cancels were retired and the 3-ring cancels appeared. And so the postmasters were instructed, use your 1848 circular date stamps as cancelers for the time being. Pen cancels were also used for smaller post offices that didn't have cancelers. And then eventually in the fall of 1856, we get the 3-ring cancels, and they were assigned alphabetically. And so this 169 is Langesund, one of the Telemark coasts. Kragerø is 160. Skien, I think, is in the 200s somewhere. And these were used for the next 2 or 3 years before, again, they are replaced by circular date stamps. But many postmasters didn't turn theirs back in. And so you'll see the 3-ring circulars way into the 1870s. So here are some examples of Norway number 1 on letters sent from the Telemark coast. This is the earliest, or one of the, no, that's not one of the earliest I have. There's a first aid cover downstairs. Tom Comnes, very famous Norwegian exhibitor, has one of only 2 known, Norway number 1 on January 1st, 1855. And it's in one of the frames downstairs in the European, no, not in the European, in the Hall of Fame, I think. Anyway, here's a couple of examples of Norway number one. This is Skien, Kragerø, Langesund, and Porsgrunn. So,
Everyone with the stock on the road.
yep,
Is that usually the case?
it is. And that makes it also interesting to wonder how many of them are forgeries.
Yeah.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Yep. So I wanted to show you an example. It wasn't my intent to have Eigil walk in the door right as I started talking about this, but here's an example of a study that I have from an exhibit that I bought. And Eigil actually turns out he helped that exhibitor put this together. But this shows that period in 1856 when they had reverted to circular date stamps. And from about February 1856 to July of 1856, they were using circular date stamps. And this just shows the evolution in that town of Skien. And that February 2nd one that was included in that exhibit is the earliest recorded. There was a latest recorded too, but that had been sold to someone else, so that's not in my collection. But then by August of 1856, you'll see the three-ring in production. You of course don't know in this case what date that is, but when you see it in a combination on a cover with a circular date stamp, you can date them, and they're known from August. So just for people who are collecting postmarks, that early 1856 period is interesting. Now, the first issue was fairly limited in numbers, although a lot have survived. And many people thought that first Norwegian issue wasn't particularly attractive. So in 1856 and 57, the first issue is replaced with a series of 4 stamps featuring King Oscar. And these are known, used well into the 1860s. And these actually also are the only Norwegian stamps that were printed in Sweden. And this is Swedish King Oscar I. Now, King Oscar I died shortly after these were issued. And so by 1859, even though they had a huge supply of them left, they were replaced with another coat of arms looking stamp that was used through the 1860s. So this is called coat of arms 1. And then you have the Oscar period, and then you have the coat of arms 2 and coat of arms 3. But here you can see some examples of the Oscar shilling. They are known in 2, 3, 4, and 8 shilling denominations. And you can see this one is from Skien with a circular date canceller. These 3 are Kragerø, which is the 3-ring 160. This was a cover I acquired fairly recently, and it's the largest known domestic cover to the Telemark coast of Norway. Tom Comnes has a bigger one downstairs, but it's not to the Telemark coast. But I'm not competing with him yet. So this is my claim to fame. It's the biggest one to Telemark County, and it's a 6-weight letter. So essentially, if you sent a regular letter that weighed 1 lod, which is 15.6 grams, it would be 1 4-shilling stamps, and then for each other weight class, it would be another stamp. So a 6x letter is fairly unusual in Norway in the 1860s. So in 1860s, we start seeing a significant increase in international mail, and we operate with a country where the fjord freezes in the winter. So there are 2 rates. There's a summer rate by steamship, and there's a winter rate by land. And so here's an example of a letter sent using the summer rate through Sandnessund. Now, Sandnessund is actually a physical location in Norway, but that postmark was put on a ship. And the cancel, will have happened somewhere along the Telemark coast between Norway and Denmark. And this one here, in this case, went to Honfleur in France. And it's got the 3 8-shillings and 1 2-shilling. So for a total of 26 shilling, which would have been the appropriate rate from Norway to France. I realize I'm going way longer than I had told you. I've never given this presentation before. I haven't timed myself, so I'll go a little faster. But this would have been approximately the route it would have traveled by boat from Christiania to Kiel in Germany, then on train to Hamburg, another train to Paris, and then on the Cherbourg line from Paris to on Florida, just to show an example of a route that a letter would have traveled in 1859. Here is one that traveled the winter route. And so in the winter, you would have gone up to Oslo or Christiania, and down across Svinesund, which is the border between Norway and Sweden, and follow the Swedish coastline down to Helsingborg and over to Helsingør, and then on to the continent from there. And it's interesting because this was sent from Langesund, and Langesund and Svinesund almost sounds the same. And so it almost looks like that postmark is the same, but that postmark actually says Svinesund. So it's a transit postmark when it exited Norway. And sometimes you'll find those on the back. Here you can see it again. This is another letter. This went to Holland, and you can see the Svinesund transfer mark there, and you got a receiving mark in Hamburg, and you got an origin postmark from Kragerø.
Were the postage rates the same summer and winter?
No, they were higher in the winter. This one is one of that might be interesting to Eigil because he has a very impressive registered mail exhibit right here. And this letter was sent from Fredrikshald, which is on the Swedish border, to Skien. But then on the flip side, to save paper, they used the same letter to send it from Skien back to Fredrikshald. But notice going out, it was a 4-shilling rate. And coming back, they didn't put a stamp on, and therefore it was the 5-shilling rate. They had a 5 mark. So it's kind of an interesting letter because it's registered. It's 2 uses, and it's one with stamp and one without. So here's one, and people say, "Why is this in your exhibit? What does this have to do with the Telemark coast, the French letter?" Well, in 1870, Paris was under siege by Prussia, and the only way to get mail out was by balloon. Well, one of those balloons kind of blew a little bit off course. It was headed from Paris south to Tours, and instead it blew across the North Sea, and it crash landed in the mountains in Telemark County, just north of Skien, at a place called Ilifjell. Incidentally, my kids have gone to something called Norgesskolen, which is a Norwegian school for foreign kids. And Egil just told me his grandkids are going there this summer. So Norwegian kids are hiking this mountain this summer. But that's where 2 French balloonists crash landed in 1870. And this letter just happened to be on that flight. So this is the first trans-ocean airmail in the history of man. And it just landed in Telemark County. And it was returned and made it to its destination in Cherbourg, not Cherbourg, but in, I forget, Jarmut in south of Paris. About a month later, it made it to its destination. So by a detour to Norway. There are no Norwegian postmarks on it because it wasn't supposed to go to Norway. And I assume they returned it in a sealed bag. Quite a few. And there are 2 types. They're the type they dumped in the ocean because they almost crash landed in the ocean and they had to relieve their weight. And so they dumped about half in the ocean, and some fishermen fished those up, and the stamps had come off of those. So if it's a stampless cover, you know it's the one that ended up in the ocean. And if it still has a stamp on like this one, it landed in the mountains. And there's quite a few of these. I bought this at an auction 2 years ago, and there were about 50 of them, probably all from the same collector. All right, I'm going to finish up here quickly, just a few more examples. This one is interesting because it speaks to the timber industry in Kragerø. I mentioned earlier, big forestry sector. That was a big industry. And this is in 1872. And it's sent from Kragerø to Elgin, Scotland. And the letter basically says, "We apologize, but we are unable to deliver as much timber this year as we normally can because of drought." So they had drought in the 1870s too. And what does drought have to do with timber? Well, they didn't have enough water to float the timber down the rivers. And so, the drought would have only hindered the trees' growth for 1 year, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was they couldn't float it downstream to the harbor to transport it out to the continent or to England in this case. And so basically it says, "I'm sorry, timber is scarce and you're going to have to pay a little bit more if you want timber. So we get into the 1870s and we get the Norwegian post horn stamps, the longest running stamp series in the world, still being made today. In fact, I got a little page on that down in the Scandinavian Club. And these were introduced in 1872. Here's one sent from Skien in 1873. And what happened in 1872 is they dropped the postal rates. Unlike today, where we keep increasing our postal rates, it actually the postal service got more and more efficient. We could drop the rate, kind of like with the Pony Express yesterday. And so it went from 4 shillings to 3 shillings for a domestic letter. This one I just found in an auction, and this is one of those sort of you wonder if there's a higher power looking out for philatelists because I just happened to glance for something else on an auction website and I saw this letter. Nobody bid on it, and I got it for not a steal, but a very good price. And this is the earliest known cancel of the 1 shilling post horn. So it's the earliest registered cancel in June 11th, 1873. And what made it special to me, it was my great uncle who exportized it in 1950s. And he wrote it up in a book that I have. And so for me, it has both that, well, it's sent to Kragerø, its earliest known cancel, and my great uncle who got me started in stamp collecting as a child was the exportizer. So that was like, wow, I have to have that. Just another example of shilling stamps used to permanent in Holland. This branches correspondence is huge. There's a lot of letters out there from that one. And this is a 7 and a 2, so it's a 9 shilling letter to Netherlands in 1874. I'm just going to wrap up with, since we are here in the United States. So in 1875, Norway joins the UPU. In 1877, we change our currency to a decimal system. So we go from shilling to øre. And so 1 shilling is converted to 3 øre, and 100 øre is a 1 krone. And that's still our currency to this date. So here's a captain's letter that I just thought was hilarious that I want to include. Again, sent from Kragerø to a captain in Valencia on SS Heimdall. And you can see that it's been forwarded numerous times, first to the Norwegian and Swedish consul. Nobody claimed it there, so it got forwarded to, well, the Norwegian consul in Marseille. But if you look at the back, you can see that it has a London mark, it has a Valencia mark, it has a Marseille mark. This letter has traveled around, and finally it says not collected for, and it's returned to Norway. U.S. immigration of Norwegians moving to the U.S. starts in 1825, but it peaks in the 1880s. And Norway is second only to Ireland of immigrants to the United States. A very large portion of the population emigrated and settled, of course, in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. And there's representatives right there in the third row of that. And they settled in United States. They settled in Canada, as this one is. This is sent from Kragerø to Canada. But even though there are as many Norwegians in the United States today with Norwegian heritage as there are in Norway, there's about 6 million Norwegians or people with Norwegian heritage. Few of them came from the Telemark coast. And the reason why is that the Telemark coast still had very strong economy in the 1880s. And so there was less reason for emigrating. But if you go further into Telemark County, you'll see a lot more people. In fact, a famous mail delivery man that operated in California named Snowshoe Thompson came from Tin Telemark, which is another great story. But again, outside the scope of today. But I'm going to finish up with this cover because I thought this was kind of funny. This was sent from Kragerø in 1883 to Mayville. And if you look closely, you will see it says DT, Dakota Territory. Trail County. Yeah. But here's the problem.
Okay, this is the Mayville.
But here's the problem. If you look really closely on this postmark, and you can't see it here, that says WIS. It got sent to Mayville, Wisconsin by accident. And then it says here, missent and forwarded. And August 20th, it was in Mayville, Wisconsin. 3 days later, it shows up in Mayville, DAK. So I don't think mail travels any faster from Mayville, Wisconsin to Mayville, North Dakota today than it did in 1883. So with that, I appreciate your time. And if you want to see Tom Comna's exhibit, it's downstairs in these frames. Eigil's exhibit on registered mail is also phenomenal. And of course, Eigil's Cunard line is off the chart. It's so good that they made a book about it that you can buy from the cornfield stand. So that's it. An hour. Thank you. And thank you for those who joined.